I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to the Conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. Friday is our special day. We talk about health and healing. We call it the Healing Circle. I'm pleased to be joined today, sitting in as co-host with me, partner Dr. Oliver Williams. Dr. Williams, good morning. Good to see you. How are you?
I'm good. It's good to see you, Al. It's been a while.
Good to see you as well. You know, and our colleague and friend, Dr. B, is she might be joining us. I'm not sure yet, but if she does, great. If she doesn't, we'll be returning to our regular format with her in the future. But, you know, we always started this program on Friday with the discussion, usually by her, about the Healing Circle. And I loved just hearing her every week explain a protocol that we use that respects and honors both the past, the present, and the future. And I'm going to ask you, Dr. Williams, if you would talk about the Healing Circle and the protocol.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned before, I won't do it as wonderfully as Dr. Bravada does it, but I'll do my best. And for me, the Healing Circle is important because it operates again as a circle where there's no head, there's no people who are subordinate. It's a circle. It has some equality, but it has some interesting elements to it. You know, where people can contribute, that they pass the talking stick to other members who are a part of the circle and having the conversation. And also, as we have people who ask questions who are in the community, being able to ask those questions. And one of the things that's interesting for me is the fact that you respect different elements of the circle. Among them, you respect people who are elders, and you respect the elders for among the different reasons, because we build on them, and we stand on their shoulders. But in addition, we respect the elders because they're closer to the ancestors, and the ancestors are closest to God. So, and I like the egalitarian elements of a circle as well, in terms of respecting everybody's voice associated with that. So again, it's my hacked version of Bravada's excellent way of being able to describe it. So with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thank you. And that was perfect. And I love hearing you as well. You know, honestly, Dr. Williams, I feel like I'm the greatest beneficiary of our gathering every week. I have a chance to sit at the feet of two great and wise individuals. And I learn, and I'm grateful for that. So thank you so much. Well, today will be another experience to learn for me. I hope for our viewers and audiences as well. Before I bring on our guest, I want to suggest to anybody that's listening on any of the social media platforms. We're on 2 YouTube channels. We're on Facebook, we're on LinkedIn, and we're on Twitter. And if you're connecting at either of those locations, those platforms, we thank you for connecting. We want you to engage. And you can send a note in through the comment section on any platform. It will show up here. But we'd also like you to be a subscriber, to support this work, this conversation, to help us grow a community of people that are talking about things that matter, as we do. And you can do that by taking a minute to go over to the YouTube Insight News MN channel. That's our YouTube platform. And there you subscribe, like, and share. So we are north of 600. Our goal is to get 1,000 subscribers. It takes time. And we are asking you week after week, day after day, person by person. So I'm asking you, wherever you are right now, to become a subscriber, and also to tell your friends, let them know that we're here and we want to have them involved in the conversation. Also, if you have topics, suggestions, if you want to be on this conversation, we want you on it. So reach out to us. You can reach out to us at the producer's email. It's Cooper at insightnews.com. He runs the show, and we'll work out how we can work together on creating, co-authoring, collaborating on important conversations. Well, today our program focuses on and invites and welcomes Dr. Ann Pellegrini. Dr. Pellegrini is the professor of performance studies and social and cultural analysis at New York University. They're also a psychologist in private practice in New York City, where they specialize in work with LGBTQ plus individuals. Dr. Pellegrini has published 6 books. Their most recent book is Gender Without Identity, co-authored with Dr. Avgi Saketopoulou. We want to go over several ideas. And the first, Dr. Pellegrini, is to welcome you to the program and to have you introduce your book, the vision and the purpose, the intent of the book you've written, this newest book we're talking about. Welcome to the program. I'm going to hand the talking stick to you. And with your permission, I'll refer to you as Dr. Pellegrini or as Ann. You've given me permission to do that, so I'll go back and forth.
Thank you. And thank you both. It's such a pleasure to get to be in conversation with you today. So as you just mentioned, I've recently co-written a book with another psychoanalyst, Avgi Saketopoulou, who's sorry she's not able to be in this conversation with us today. But I'm very excited to have the chance to talk about our book. So we're both clinical psychoanalysts who also teach. I teach full-time at New York University. And we wrote this book to intervene into what has actually become a very kind of I would say violent public conversation about especially transgender issues and the status of trans children in particular. And we're in the midst of, it's now, what is it, March 1st? And in these first months of the new legislative year, more than 400 anti-LGBTQ bills have been put into state legislatures around the country. So there are 400 bills already, and the year is young, that state legislatures are taking up that would restrict access to gender affirmative care, that would make put all sorts of limits on what could be talked about in classrooms, that would ban trans athletes from participating in school teams. I mean, so many, I would say, homophobic and transphobic bills have already been introduced into legislatures. And in the face of this quite virulent opposition to trans life in particular, but also to queer people, it has seemed that for LGBTQ people ourselves, as well as for allies, that the only way we can defend the existence of trans and queer people, and the only way we can call, basically say, stop discriminating against us, is to make the following kind of claim. We're born this way. Mm-hmm. And because we're born this way and we can't change, therefore we deserve protection from discrimination. Right? This born this way argument has previously been used to advocate for, lesbian and gay people, right? So, and one can understand, I'm sympathetic to this kind of argument because in the face of, again, this really profound legislative onslaught, it has seemed like, what can we say? But, and as against that view, right, that trans people or non-binary people or queer people are born that way, opponents of trans life and opponents of queer people will make the counter argument. They'll say, in fact, no one's actually trans. People just think they're trans because some kind of bad thing happened to them. There was some sort of trauma, say, or maybe they ended up on the wrong internet site, or maybe a teacher gave them the wrong sorts of ideas that something warped someone in their gender. Everyone's supposed to be binary. If at the moment of birth, the doctor says it's a boy, you're supposed to grow up to be a boy who'll become a man. If the doctor says it's a girl, right? Similarly, you're going to be a girl who'll become a woman. It's binary. So we have these two approaches. Trauma has caused someone's gender to be warped. With the right kind of therapeutic intervention, we can heal that person so that they come back into their normative gender. And as against that, those of us who want to defend trans and queer life, it has seemed as if the only argument we can make on their behalf is born that way. So it's this context that our book is trying to intervene in, because we want to say something that might seem surprising. We actually don't think that anyone is born that way. We don't think that people are born gay. We also don't think they're born straight. We don't think people are born trans. We also don't think they're born normatively gendered, or what has come to be called cis. We think that all gender and all sexuality is something people acquire in a very complex way. This isn't about choice. Like you wake up in the morning, pull down the Facebook drop-down menu and decide, I'm going to be this, right? It's a much more complex acquisition. And so that's already a pretty provocative claim. But the other thing is that, again, we're psychoanalysts and we sit and we listen to people. We think that trauma may well play a part in how anyone comes into their gender or comes into their sexuality, not just trans people, not just queer people, but we think that trauma actually shapes the everyday experience of gender and of sexuality for everyone, right? And so we're not saying trauma causes gender or trauma causes sexuality, but we could think of it as a force. And people do things with their force. We're not just stopped dead in our tracks by trauma. We can do things with it. And one of the things that we do with trauma as human beings is we actually elaborate a self, a gendered self, a sexual self.
That's great. Thank you for that introduction. I'll take the talking stick back and you can hand it to me or hand it to Dr. Oliver, or we can request it at any time. So we have fun with this. Thank you so much, for laying that out. And I would simply ask you to go back a little bit and walk us through some of the terminology, the language definitions. And you did that about binary, but it's useful to me to be instructed on the terminologies that we're talking about, because if you don't have that instruction, you're operating with another set of ideas that probably are inappropriate, antiquated, insufficient to address the issues that are important. So take us through some language type, culture type definitions that lead to this question about gender without identity, the title of your book.
Perfect. I really love this invitation. Thank you. Because, there is vocabulary that circulates within particular communities that may not be known in another community. And if we're going to have conversations with each other and learn things, we have to be willing to translate. So I really appreciate this invitation to translate language and explain terms. So one of the terms that perhaps, you've both heard, and certainly I suspect that many of your listeners will have heard, but it's a fairly new term, is the word cisgender, which is spelled, CIS, gender. And this is a term that's actually been around now for 30 years, but it hasn't really, it's only recently that it's sort of crept more into the mainstream. It was a term that actually was kind of devised in 1994 as a way, actually as an activist term. Partly it was in order to, let's say, to say something about, I'm going to use the word normative gender, or the gender that everyone is presumed to be. That is binary gender. Again, sex and gender are supposed to match. And there's only two ways to be in the world, male or female. And so anyone who experienced themselves to be trans, anyone who was trans, these were they were the gender weirdos, right? Whereas otherwise, the people who were like normatively gendered, men and women, just got to walk around and be like gender, like they had the real gender. And then there were these gender weirdos that were called trans. So cisgender is a term that basically trans activists and allies said, wait a minute, we need a way to describe this other way of being gendered, let's say normative gender, so that this too becomes a little bit strange. So because all gender is actually weird in a way. In fact, everyone does their gender a little bit differently, right? There are so many gradations, right? So cisgender was actually a kind of brilliant and kind of cheeky way to say, look, you think this is normal gender, the way that all gender is. This too is gender. This too has a flavor and a texture to it. So it's a kind of way to say, we need to mark the so-called normal and actually say, no, this is gender too. It's not just, you think about white privilege. If you read a newspaper article and the race of the person being spoken about or referred to isn't marked, most times that person's white, because that person doesn't have race. That person's just a human being.
Yep.
So it's people of color whose race gets pointed out all the time. So similarly, cisgender was a way to say, wait, these people have gender too, right? The normative gender is also gender. So that's part of the intervention. It was people were thinking about, the importance of, not letting the normal get away with posing itself as nature, as the measure of all things. And gradually though, so again, it was initially kind of this activist intervention. Gradually cisgender has started to acquire a status of being an identity all its own. But maybe I'll back up and say, so what is cisgender supposed to refer to? Cisgender describes the situation, and I think now generally people who use the term, some people will use the term to describe themselves, others will use it to describe other people, but cisgender generally refers to the following. It's a kind of congruence that you are, that there's a match, a felt match between the sex you were assigned at birth, that is the sex that was pronounced, it's a boy, it's a girl, or maybe the sex that was seen in a prenatal appointment that appeared on that ultrasound.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you're
Mm-hmm.
having a fill in the blank, right?
Okay.
A boy, a girl, right? So cisgender refers to a felt congruence between the sex assigned at birth, and then the way you kind of maybe express that sex. We'll call that part gender. The way that you express that in the world, and it feels like there's a fit between the sex you were assigned and the gender you've come to be, how you express yourself. And not only that, maybe another component, other people in the world see you that way too. So when you walk around the world, not only do you feel there to be a congruence between the sex assigned to you at birth and the gender you feel yourself to be, but other people, most of the time, recognize you as such. They see you and they know what pronoun to give to you. Mm-hmm. When you walk into a bathroom, no one tries to chase you out because you're in the wrong space, right? That's cisgender, right? Or that's the idea of it. Mm-hmm. And there are all sorts of complications with that because, which we can get into, that cisgender might not be as locked down and congruent as we assume it to be, right? That maybe it doesn't feel as stable as we think.
And maybe it's richer and more than we give it, than we limit it, right? So the question is, indeed, how do we examine the broadest breadth of what it means to be? And that examination is one in gender, but it actually leads us to examine everything more broadly, and more fully, and see connections and understand relationships. You from the notes here, you mentioned that you're both a professor and a psychoanalyst. And give us a little bit of your background, your journey to teaching and becoming the psychoanalyst, how that all informs this work and your mission work.
Yeah, no, that's a great question because they really do inform each other. I've been teaching full-time at the university level for 30 years now, which is kind of unbelievable, and I love it. I'm really passionate about teaching, and I'm in the performance studies department at NYU, and I'm also a member of the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, which is where gender and sexuality studies, Africana studies, Latinx, urban metropolitan studies, which is urban studies, and Asian American studies are located. So it's a department that's really interested in the politics of identity. So I'm really lucky to get to teach a wide range of topics. But since I got my PhD, and again I've been teaching for 30 years now, I've always been teaching classes on gender and sexuality. That's sort of like these questions are always animating any course I teach. If I teach a course on religion and politics, I'm definitely going to be talking about gender and sexuality in those classes. And one of the, and I've also been thinking about psychoanalysis for a long time, writing about it in my books, teaching classes on it as well. So it's always been there, as a background, as a resource. And I mean a resource in the following way. So when I've been teaching classes, one of the things I do is I try to help students historicize some of the categories we take for granted today. So, there's a huge body of research that talks about the ways in which the division, gay, straight, or homosexual, heterosexual, is a pretty recent historical distinction in terms of as an identity, as if these terms describe distinct ways of being in the world. Absolutely, since as long as there has been human beings, bodies have had sex with other bodies, sometimes in same sex and sometimes in cross sex, right? So homosexual practices, heterosexual practices, these have been around for a long time. But the actual sorting of people into distinct almost species of human being on the basis of whom they habitually have sex with, that's pretty recent. That really dates to, let's say, the early 19th century, right? So I teach, I'm teaching these classes, I'm helping students think about the history of these categories. I'm helping students think about historical changes and what we think gender means and what it means to be, what are socially acceptable ways to be a woman, socially acceptable ways to be a man, and then, emerging categories of transgender, right? So the students are like, yay, I get it. Yes, this is so exciting. And then, but this is all at this kind of maybe more larger level, or we could say macro level.
Mm-hmm.
They'll be persuaded by the history. It makes sense. They can, and then I had this experience in a classroom long ago, it was early in my career, and it's stuck with me ever since. I was teaching a class talking about the social construction of sexuality, right? These terms emerging into the vernacular conversations, and the student said, I get it. Sexuality is socially constructed, heterosexuality, homosexuality is socially constructed, but what made me a lesbian? The student asked.
Mm.
And I thought this was an amazing moment because I couldn't answer that,
Mm-hmm.
and nor could this student answer it. But the yearning to basically have a story about yourself isn't necessarily answered by knowing that, oh, these are historically constructed, pretty recent human inventions. Again, these are pretty recent categories. So, but why did this category speak to that student? Why did it grab that student and not some other category? That's what the student was asking me. And this is not something my amazing historical studies that I put in my syllabus, this is not something the sociology texts I could teach could answer. But psychoanalysis and other kinds of, I think especially psychoanalysis, but other, let's say psychotherapies or psychologies, those are spaces which we get to slow down, slow the world down, slow ourselves down, and actually talk about our histories, talk about what it feels like to be the person we are, what it could even feel like to become a different sort of person than we already are. That's the space in which, a student like that, or, could then ask this question. So yeah, like, why did that category grab me? And importantly for the student, the why was not a freak out, like, and can I make it stop? It was more like, of all the possibilities, why this one? Right? So I think for me, I've been writing about psychoanalysis for a long time and thinking with it, because I think it does help us to get to think about the texture of a human life at this micro level. I always think about it also with how does the social, and you earlier referred to the ancestors. How do the ancestors, are the histories of our families also come in and shape who we are? And not just the history of our parents or grandparents, but the histories of our great-grandparents, people we would never have met, the great-great-great-grandparents, right? This comes into us as well. So when I say the history of the individual, it's always bigger than one person, right? But for me, psychoanalysis is another way for me to think about some of the questions that I've been teaching for years. And I love this. I love that they don't fully line up, that the big social questions I'm asking in the classroom are not going to line up exactly with the more, well, I'll say smaller because it's a person in the room with me, but it's not small to that person. I love that they don't line up exactly, because that to me is what's exciting, that we have these gaps, right? And for me, the gaps are a place where we get to change and ask questions that don't have an easy answer or just one answer. I hope that makes sense. Like, I love the space that we get to ask questions. It's pretty amazing.
Awesome. Dr. Oliver, jump in. And
yeah. Well, as I was reading the show notes about it, I thought it was sort of interesting looking at some of the ways that people may construct the issue about gender and the idea of gender without identity, or gender with identity. And so it didn't seem like there was one specific perspective in which you sort of advance things. I have a colleague that teaches at a religious university, or did teach at a religious university, but he was a psychologist. And his name is Andy Johnson. And Dr. Andy Johnson was at Bethel University. And it's interesting to me with Andy. So one of the areas that I have done my work in is the area of domestic violence. And so Andy's done an interesting perspective, and we both do things looking at faith and faith perspectives around domestic violence. And I have a colleague that's in South Africa that has a South African Faith and Family Institute, and she deals with 9 different faiths and encouraging them to be basically a resource around addressing the issue of domestic violence. But there are cultural influences that shapes people's perspective to either encourage you attending to the issue or discourage you attending to the issue. But faith, in my perspective, ought to be a resource for people. So, the question is, how can you be helpful in terms of addressing that issue? That being said, Andy is also a person that has a perspective about working with the LGBT plus community. And when he talks about it, in Minnesota, they've had these efforts around legislation to be able to restrict attention around gender identity and that encourage perspectives to deal with people who have a perspective about gender identity, to discourage it. And Andy's says, look, you can't discourage it. You have to be able to support the people and the approaches in which might be helpful and not smash those people in different ways. So when I was reading the show notes, I thought it was really interesting because I felt like there was a lot of latitude in considering different elements associated. And one thing I think is that people need to, like you did at the introduction, you really gave us some information to be able to examine and to explore. But like it did in the title of your book, you gave people some room to be able to struggle with it and to be able to think it through. And but with not necessarily, unless you read your book, the answers in terms of directing how people need to think about things. So I do think that on the one hand, we need to be educated more broadly as a group of people, despite the fact that people may or may not agree with different things, but we need to be educated about things. And so over my life, I think I got more education about GLB efforts and explanations and connections with that, but not as much around the transgender. And to me, I would like you to help educate us where we don't make as many mistakes associated with it. That's one element. The other thing that I think is interesting is the notion of trauma as being an influence on what produces people's sense of self associated with their development of a gender identity. Some people think that there have been things, and I know of that. We look at I can't think of his name. He's Puerto Rican, and he came out several years ago. Now he was married, he got divorced, and he's got children that he raises.
Ricky Martin.
Ricky Martin. And Ricky, in his life, he had been sexually abused by his mentor in the for Menudo. So, and I wonder about what, in his mind, how did that influence his thinking about his, identity? And did it influence his decisions associated with being a gay man? So I know he tried to hide it for a while, and then he came out, and glad he came out and all that. But I wonder about that. And I wonder, even though I know trauma doesn't explain it. When I think of Russ and think about the statement that was made in the the film, he talked about the fact that, dealing with equality, if you dealt with the fact, and it's important to deal with the fact that he's a Black man, that it was also important for him to be acknowledged as a gay man too.
Yeah.
So, help us to make sense of it. And for people who may be less informed about it, how do you help people develop a sense of self when they're not being repressed? And the idea to me that DeSantis says don't say gay, in Florida, doesn't make any sense to me. People exist in the world, and people have that experience as who they are. Then why would he want to end up pretending like it doesn't exist? It doesn't make sense. So help in the understanding. I mean, you took on a big topic.
We did.
Help us think it through.
All right. Dr. Williams, you've just laid out so much. So I want to pull on some of the threads that you just presented, because there are some just amazing things to pull on and then try to stitch back together. One thing I will say about DeSantis and, don't say gay in Florida, which was basically you can only have age-appropriate conversations about gender and sexuality in the classroom.
Right.
And it really reduced the possibility of talking about anyone who's not binary in their gender or anyone who's not heterosexual, right? And at the same time, they also passed a law banning any teaching of, I'm going to say, so-called critical race theory.
Right.
I say so-called critical race theory because I wish that critical race theory were being taught in elementary schools in Florida or anywhere else in this country. Like, we should be so lucky, right?
That's
so
right.
these are being passed at the same time to limit the possibility of actually talking about the expansiveness of people who already live in our country, right? So this is like, they have an agenda that's not just about the most narrow ways of thinking about gender and sexuality, but incredibly narrow ways of thinking about the race and basically the history of racism in this country, right? These are not separate for those legislators in the state of Florida and elsewhere. That's the first thing to say. But the example of Ricky Martin is very interesting, and what I'm going to say is in no way based upon anything I've heard Ricky Martin say. So this is really hypothetical. I want to be very careful about that. But that Ricky Martin experienced sexual abuse from an adult when he was a much younger person. It's very easy in the popular mind to think, does that explain it? Is that why he's gay, right? And that association is so quick, right? And my hunch is, again, I have no idea if this is the case, but it would be very possible, I'll put it this way, that this is something that's worried Ricky Martin too, right?
Yeah.
Because of cultural association between sexual abuse as somehow warping you. If you're gay and you were sexually abused, that must be why you're gay. Now, the first thing to say is, sadly, many people in this country have been sexually abused and they grow up to be straight. So we know that being sexually abused, doesn't necessarily, it can have all sorts of impacts, but there isn't any one-to-one correspondence between sexual abuse and what happens in your sexuality later on, right? So that's the first thing to say. But the second, and this is really important, and I can't emphasize it enough, that it doesn't matter how anyone became gay or queer or trans or non-binary, because there's nothing wrong with being gay or queer or trans or non-binary. Not only that, there's no wrong way to become it, right? So it is possible. Again, I do not know Ricky Martin. I don't know what he said about this, but it is very possible that a sexual trauma might in fact have some contribution. It doesn't cause, it could have some contribution to the shape one's sexuality takes later on in life. But not because you've been warped, but because there's something there's something in that experience that it becomes an energy. And then the important thing is that you can do something with that energy as opposed to something that was just done to you, that you can take it and it becomes something that's yours, not something, again, that was done to you, right? And I can tell you that I certainly sit with patients myself, and I hear people talk about experiences they've had. And some of, people who are heterosexual, people who are normatively gendered, people who are queer, people who are trans, and everyone has something that's happened to them earlier in their life, and they start to wonder, is this why I am this way now? And, that's not my question for them. This is the question someone has to ask of themselves, and to make the space to ask this. And then even the bigger space of, oh, maybe I've been able to do something with this earlier thing that happened to me, right? And this doesn't mean necessarily that if someone who experienced sexual abuse as a young person grows up to be gay, that again, doesn't mean they were warped. We could even think about that trauma as some sort of energetic resource, right? But maybe I'll give an example that connects to domestic violence, because Dr. Williams, you brought this up. Mm-hmm. We know that certainly domestic violence happens with same-sex couples too, but the main emergency around domestic violence is the situation of women being abused by their male partners, right?
Right.
And for too many women in the culture we inhabit, and this goes across class, goes across racial and ethnic groups, right? No one group can claim the monopoly on domestic violence, right? We know that for too many women in our culture, the very meaning of what it is to be a woman is shaped by the specter of violence, whether the specter of sexual assault, the specter of domestic violence. Maybe the violence has happened to them, but it's just, even if it hasn't, girls are taught from an early age, like, to be very careful walking down the street, to worry about talking to strangers in the way that boys aren't, right? So we could even say that the very possibility of sexual trauma is part of what produces normative femininity. I'll say this more strongly. I said earlier that trauma may have a share in the acquisition or the coming into any gender. Trauma is deeply shaping of what it is to be a woman in our culture.
Right.
Whether a cisgender woman or a trans woman. We know that trans women are at high risk of violence, right? But this is a way to think about trauma and gender, right? In a way that I think is very maybe clear to many of your listeners. And if a patient comes to me, if someone comes to me and wants to see me as a therapist, and is, let's say someone who identifies as a woman, she was, ascribed female at birth, is cisgender, and she's talking to me about her experiences, I'm not going to try to talk her out of being a woman, right? I'm not going to say, well, trauma is part of what shaped your experience of your gender, so maybe you should try a different gender, right? It's rather, I'm not trying to cure her of her femininity.
Right.
My task is to help her live in her gender more fully, her gender. And that's not my gender, it's hers, right? So similarly, if someone who's, trans, and I work with many trans people, might be talking to me about violence they've experienced, my job is not to cure them of their transness, it's to help them inhabit their body, inhabit their gender in a way that is the best fit for them. Mm-hmm. And I could say this also with people I work with who are queer and have, histories of violence in their background, having experienced violence. I don't need to cure their queerness. There's nothing to be cured, because there's nothing wrong with being queer, but how to live, in their bodies, to live in the full dimension of their sexual lives with less shame, right? Yeah. With more possibility for flourishing. That's my job, because it's not my life, it's theirs.
Mm-hmm. That's it. Thank you.
Let me take a break and come back. This is fascinating. I've got a gazillion questions. I not have time to ask any of them, but I'll nod to a couple of them when we come back. We'll take a break. I'm Al McFarlane. This is the Conversation with Al McFarlane. Friday, the Healing Circle. My guest, Dr. Ann Pellegrini. My colleague, Dr. Oliver Williams, co-hosting today. We'll be right back. If you've not done so, consider getting vaccinated against the COVID-19 virus. At vaccine.gov, enter your zip code, your preferred vaccine type, and you'll get a map with locations eager to serve you. Getting vaccinated saves lives. Vaccine.gov can help you do your part. So we're back. And Dr. Ann, as you were describing, the potential impact or the impacts of trauma, I'm translating that as you speak into what you described as trauma. To me, looks like culture, and it has the same power, the same mechanical impact of shaping impact as the culture. And maybe it is an overlay or interface of culture itself. but it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere all the time. And the question is, do we see it or know it, or have we sort of narrowly focused on horrific or specific incidents that we say are not the norm? But part of this conversation asked me to think about, how do I limit things to being the norm? And are they really the norm? Is the norm somebody else's convenience and not a ultimately useful shorthand? And are we limiting ourselves? So that's one sort of thought. The second thought is about, you responded to me referring to the ancestors. And is there a path, is there a study, a way of studying that examines how human beings categorized or did not categorize earlier? You mentioned that these things are social constructs that probably came about in the 19th century or so. And that's kind of the same as race, as a social construct. Our humanity at the core is a humanity that binds us all into one family. And if we look more deeply and broadly, we can also see the connections between ourselves as living beings and other living beings, whether they're animal or microscopic. And we can ultimately see the connection between all of these living beings and things that exist, but are not living as we describe living. Living is a decision and a description as well, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of head tripping here a little bit on this conversation. How is there a place to reset our thinking about what it means to be human being that lets us avoid the destructive and dismissive and marginalizing impact of identities that, again, create a shorthand, right? But don't really allow everything to be its full self.
Yes.
That makes sense at all? The question. I'll hand it back to you, Anne.
Yeah, no, that I actually, what you said makes a lot of sense to me. And, we entitled this book Gender Without Identity, not because we're seeking to legislate as if we could do so, as if we could just pronounce and say, stop using the word gender identity, people. Like, we're not legislating against that terminology because we couldn't, but we're trying to loosen the grip that a term like identity has, because I think we've poured so much into identity as if it's the very essence of us, like it's the truth of who we are. And we want to loosen that a little bit because, in fact, people's gender shifts over their lifetime. Even people who don't understand themselves as trans or as gender non-binary undergo shifts in the meaning of their gender because, even if you're ascribed male at birth, you grew up to be a boy who becomes a man, the meaning of your maleness, your masculinity will change for you across your lifetime. So too for someone ascribed female at birth who grows up to be a girl or becomes a woman, like her femininity, the meaning of her womanliness is going to change across her lifetime. So everyone's gender shifts a little bit. And so identity makes us seem like it's all locked in to, like, it's just, again, inborn in us in some way. So that's partly we're pressuring, that's the without identities. What if we loosened it, right? What if we think about, again, how all gender shapeshifts in some way? For some people, maybe more dramatically than others, but also we might change and change again. It's like, in some sense, it's transition all the way down for all of us. That's, our thinking. But I want to pick up on something you said that's really important about also the social invention of categories of racial difference. And you have quite accurately said there's something interesting about the coincidence that these categories that divide people on the basis of their quote unquote sexuality arose historically shortly after we see also emerging categories that distinguish between people and also hierarchalize them. Don't just distinguish, but rank them. This group is better than that group. Like the emergence of racial categories preceded, but not by that long, the emergence of these categories of difference on the basis of sexuality, right? So there is, and we know that, unfortunately, there's a pretty nasty crossover between those. So that, for example, in this ranking, we know which race was put at the top, this so-called race. I'll say so-called because as if these are immutable, like always existing categories, right? We know that white people get put on top, right? Mm-hmm. White people are imagined to be capable of rationality, capable of discipline. This also meant that white people might be more capable of sexual self-control, right? So that there's something about white sexuality, white heterosexuality that's more respectable. So the sexualities of other racial groups, so-called, these sexualities were often imagined to be animalistic. I mean, there's a profoundly violent history around the attribution of a kind of hypersexuality to Black men in particular, right? So we can see this, again, this really violent crossover between stereotypes to do with race and stereotypes to do with sexuality, right? They've been quite pernicious, and we're still living that history, right? Some of us are living that history more painfully and at greater threat of violence than some others, right? So that's, I think this is so important to take into account. And one of the things I hear you suggesting, Al, is the idea that what if we didn't have all that filter of categories, right? What would it mean to live in a world where we weren't so quick to categorize? And in some sense, it's a wild thought experiment, right? And I wonder if the issue is less the matter of having categories than suspending our belief in them as the truth. Because humans, the kinds of creatures we are, like, we make distinctions between things. This thing is like that thing. Oh, this thing is different than that thing. And difference often produces great anxiety. Like, oh, that difference is a little bit scary. I don't understand that. But what if we could develop the muscle to experience difference? Maybe it will feel threatening initially, but actually, like, not be so reactive. Like, oh, relax a little bit. Like, oh, maybe it only feels threatening because I don't understand it. Like, difference isn't the problem. It's the hierarchicalization of difference that's the problem. And then I think we get so afraid of differences that then we harden them. Oh, these are true differences. And there's the good and the bad, like, I'm not different. The difference belongs to those other people, right? Bad difference. So it's like, how do we learn to experience difference differently? That would be like the short way to say it.
And
not easy.
Would be, how do we get to where we can understand and negotiate the immenseness of difference, where difference is not a divider, but it's an asset that continues to evolve and that sort of builds on itself. And from the observer's point of view, difference ought to be, how do you train the observer? How does one train oneself to examine all of the potentials? I think you mentioned earlier, when you show up, you're showing up really as a reflection of your parents and your peers and your neighborhoods and things like that. And you talked about your grandparents and great-grands and great-grands, people you don't know, that all of those things are showing up in you. And how do we train ourselves then to be conscious, aware, and intentional in examining and engaging all of the rich aspects of what beingness is? How do we retool how we negotiate existence itself in a way that allows us to both know and appreciate the infinity of possibilities, each of which is real and can be real, and neither of which, I think, has to be necessarily graded as better or put in the hierarchy that says this is and not that. That's what I'm hearing. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is actually incredibly beautiful and deeply challenging, because the challenge is how to do it, right? And I think part of it is, what does it mean to cultivate a curiosity, right? So that in the face of difference and in an encounter with difference, our first reaction isn't, fight or flight, right? And this is, I'm an educator, right? I've been teaching for a long, long time. I love it. I think that one of the things that I love about teaching is that every single student in that classroom is different from each other,
Mhm.
right? I'm different from them. I'm different from year to year because I'm learning from my students, right?
Mhm.
So, and like all this difference, that is a laboratory of possibility, right? I don't want to produce students who all agree with me. I want to give people the ability to be curious, to think critically, to ask questions, including new questions about themselves, right? So when the state of Florida, basically bans the critical race theory they're not teaching, but bans really any discussion of the history of race and racism in this country. When it bans expansive discussion about gender and sexuality, it's reducing a space for children to actually practice curiosity. I don't even want to say learn curiosity, to practice the curiosity they already have. They're being told you're only allowed to be curious about certain things. And if you're curious about these other things, that's wrong, because that way of being in the world is wrong. I mean, it's deforming curiosity rather than helping to, again, help students practice it. We could all do with more spaces to practice curiosity. That doesn't mean we can't come to form opinions and values. I mean, I have some values as I look at the political landscape right now. The fact that I want to be curious about other people doesn't mean I feel shy about coming to sort of considered ethical and political viewpoints about certain issues. I mean, I'm pretty critical of don't say gay in Florida, right? So to be curious doesn't mean you have to throw up your hands and be like, well, we can't decide, it's all the same, right? But it's about, again, not like to create a greater tolerance for things we don't know or understand, right? Not to be, it's actually very hard. I think about this as a teacher a lot, and I try to keep this in mind. To learn something new means you have to be humbled, because to learn something new means you first have to discover you didn't know something, which is a blow to one's narcissism, right? It's like, oh my God, I didn't know that yet. So if we're going to learn something, we constantly have to, like, I don't know, have this little dip. So how do we also, like, from the beginning, like, create the possibility of, like, oh, you didn't know? That's awesome. Now you get to know stuff, right? So it's, again, I think this is part of it too, that to cultivate curiosity means cultivating a certain sturdiness in the face of things we don't understand. And that we didn't yet know, because how could we? How could we have known it yet?
So unfortunately, trans people are, it seems, more highly victimized, targeted for crime in society. If that's the case, what do we do to turn that inside out, upside down, where people don't fear that they are trans or may be trans or may know someone who's trans, but rather we create a society which celebrates and elevates the gift of transship, right?
Yeah.
And we view transship as one of the many modalities that express the will and potential of creation itself. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way to put it. And I think it connects. I'm thinking about something Dr. Williams had brought up earlier, but what would it mean to see faith communities as a resource for tackling, transphobic and homophobic violence, rather than saying, if you're religious, you're obviously anti-LGBTQ. That's just not the case. There are many LGBTQ people who are also deeply religious. They were raised in a spiritual or religious tradition, and it remains important to them, right? These are not oppositional. That's the first thing to say.
Right.
But I think that trans people, part of what, and I said both my co-author and I are members of the LGBTQ plus community, so these issues really matter to us, right? I think that trans people in particular are being targeted in part because of fear. They're standing in for all sorts of cultural and social changes that many that normatively gendered people are finding scary. Gender is shape-shifting all the time. And somehow trans people are being seen as the visible representation of it. Like, if only we stop transness, then gender will go back to the way it always was, and which is just not the case. I mean, the traditional family, traditional gender is itself historically new, right? But we're rather than being curious about, oh my gosh, look at all these new genders in the world, how cool. Instead, it's like, no, we have to, I don't understand this, therefore it has to go away, right? It's like, the apparent newness of trans, and I say the apparent newness because trans people have been around for a long, long time, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the apparent newness of it, the heightened visibility, is paradoxically bringing more violence.
Mm-hmm.
Because before, people, didn't, people who understand themselves being normatively gendered didn't have to see it, or could not see what they're seeing.
Right.
There's this overburden on transness, rather than just being letting gender just be in all of the shapes it comes in.
Mm.
Dr. Williams, got about a minute. Thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just eating it up. I have some friends that have been useful for me for their friendship, but also in terms of understanding things more deeply. That were actually professors in New York at Hunter College, as a matter of fact, and Bogart Leeshore when he was there, and friend named Sam Amar, and another friend named Beth Ritchie, who was very thoughtful in terms of, and Beth was involved in an institute that I used to have.
I know Beth Ritchie's work. It's wonderful.
Yeah. And so, but a number of friends that we have in common, have been very thoughtful about the things and sort of moved us along in terms of understanding. But her courageous work has been very, very useful in a lot of elements and things that she's created too. So I'm just, I could listen to you more. And so it'd be interesting to be able to maybe have more conversations and to invite you back if I have that permission, Al. And,
Absolutely.
and then with with some of the other people that we know, like Andy Johnson, would be interesting to join the conversation, and to get Sam and Beth and a few other people that I can think of could add to the richness of it, because in addition to dealing with gender differences, to also talk about race and gender issues. But I had to tell you that the title of the book was something that it was interesting to me, and the notion of being able to have a gender, even the breadth of gender, and not have an identity associated with it is interesting to me. And so that's something that maybe we can consider, in a future conversation.
Sure. I mean, I would be delighted to come back, and I think there are so many conversations to be had also about not just gender and race, because also every gender is also raced because of the world we live in, right? Gender changes across class dimensions, across
Right.
ethnic groups, right? But religion, especially in this country, which is so as profoundly religious as the United States is, and especially the force of Christianity in this country, however pluralist we are, it's still Christian dominant. This is a big part of the story, right? About what's happening around transgender and around queer issues as well. I mean, unfortunately, a particular kind of deeply conservative Christianity is having a very, I would say, negative impact on how we're having these conversations, and drowning out other more progressive religious voices quite often.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'd like to, in a future conversation, Dr. Pellegrini and Dr. Williams talk about, I've brought it up several times before, the whole notion of hierarchy associated with patriarchy. And are there alternatives? Were there alternatives before the emergence of the patriarchal hierarchical arrangement that is predominant in the world today? Well, listen, we're out of time. This has been a great, great conversation. Dr. Ann Pellegrini, co-author of Gender Without Identity. Thank you so much for being here. We will invite you to come back and have more of this wonderful conversation. Dr. Williams, thank you so much as always.
Yeah, glad to be here.
All right, take care. We'll see you next time. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.